This is a geopolitical seismic event reverberating from the kinetic borderlands of Ukraine directly to the command centers of Moscow. The threat vector is not incoming Ukrainian cruise missiles, nor NATO airstrikes, but Russian pilots themselves executing ordnance drops on their own sovereign territory. For policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing, the cold metrics behind this series of detonations pose a critical strategic question. Is this merely the inevitable fog of war, or is it a definitive signal that the Russian military machine is suffering from advanced systemic rot? The formidable aerospace forces, once tasked with the defense of the Russian homeland, a branch into which the Kremlin poured trillions of rubles for modernization, have devolved into a shadow of their former projection capability. Instead of executing precision sorties against strategic targets deep within Ukraine, the advanced airframes, MiG-29 Fulcrums, MiG-31 Foxhounds, Su-27 Flankers, and the Su-34 fullback fleet have begun a disturbing pattern of accidental bombardment of Russian residential sectors. In layman's terms, pilots operating under the Russian flag are striking the Russian populace, not the adversary. These fratricidal incidents are not anomalies. They are becoming statistically recurrent, particularly in the Belgorod Oblast, adjacent to the Zero Line, according to an open-source intelligence assessment released by Ukrainian military intelligence on November 17. In a span of merely 11 days, Russian aviators failed to acquire their designated targets and instead jettisoned ordnance on Belgorod on 8 separate occasions. When these self-inflicted strikes are compounded by genuine Ukrainian counter-battery fire, the cumulative effect is cascading infrastructure failure, plunging vast swathes of the region into darkness. In November alone, approximately 20,000 residents of Belgorod were severed from the power grid. A major kinetic strike on the evening of November 8, targeting the Luch thermal power plant, was identified as the proximal cause of a significant blackout. Previously, on October 5, Russian sources acknowledged a missile impact on the Luch substation, leaving 40,000 civilians without electricity. However, at this juncture, external action from Ukraine is no longer the decisive variable in the equation. The Russian Air Force has effectively begun a campaign of inadvertent bombardment against its own critical infrastructure, from Belgorod's municipal grid to substations and hydrocarbon facilities. In 2025 alone, documented instances of Russian pilots striking Russian territory totaled 128. One of the most egregious examples of this self-immolation occurred in early December within the Belgorod operational zone. On the evening of December 6, sorties launched from Belgorod airfields with mission orders to strike Ukrainian positions. Instead, they delivered shrapnel, high explosive yield, and darkness upon their own citizenry. This transcends the narrative of minor navigational error or coordinate drift. Many defense analysts interpret this as concrete evidence that Vladimir Putin's war machine has metastasized into a deadly trap not only for Ukraine but for the existential integrity of the Russian state itself. As the streets of Belgorod plunged into darkness and nearly 10,000 households lost power, a singular truth was illuminated. The Russian aerospace forces have devolved into an uncontrollable liability, effectively sabotaging their own logistics and terrorizing their own population. In the eyes of strategic planners in Washington, Berlin, or Tokyo, this imagery represents more than a military mishap. It is a warning signal regarding the command and control disintegration of a nuclear-armed superpower. If we conduct a forensic dissection of this incident, the emerging picture resembles a tragicomic industrial catastrophe rather than a disciplined military operation. According to local Russian media outlets, such as the Pepel channel, and corroborated eyewitness testimony, seconds prior to the detonation, residents identified the acoustic signature of a low-altitude aircraft vectoring toward the Ukrainian border. Immediately following that sound, the chain of events that plunged tens of thousands into freezing darkness commenced. Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov attempted to sanitize the narrative, issuing vague statements regarding an unidentified projectile. However, OSINT analysts and local sources rapidly reconstructed a different reality. It was a heavy-yield aerial bomb, inadvertently jettisoned from a Russian tactical bomber. The munition did not strike a strategic military asset. It impacted a power station on Storozhevaya Street, the nexus of Belgorod's civilian infrastructure. The detonation excavated a massive crater, engulfed the substation in a firestorm, and left tens of thousands of Russian citizens exposed to the harsh winter without heating or light. Reports indicate that grid instability in Belgorod remains critical. Technically, this failure reveals a reality far grimmer than a mere blackout. It exposes the technological deterioration of the Russian arsenal. Moscow is attempting to recycle its vast stockpile of Soviet-era FAB gravity bombs by retrofitting them with crude, universal planning and correction modules, converting them into makeshift smart glide bombs. In theory, post-release, the wings deploy, gliding the munition kilometers to strike Ukrainian positions. In practice, reality has brutally falsified that theory. The most probable failure mode in the Belgorod incident is a malfunction of the homemade wing deployment mechanism or the electronic guidance suite, potentially due to Ukrainian electronic warfare suppression or gross manufacturing negligence. Instead of gliding, a multi-ton block of steel and high explosives followed a ballistic trajectory, dropping like a stone onto a Russian city. When Governor Gladkov invoked unidentified projectiles, it was a tacit admission of helplessness. To identify the origin would require admitting a hard truth to the populace. It was not the adversary who left them freezing in the dark, but their own pilots, funded by their tax rubles. The absence of air raid sirens at the moment of impact reinforces this conclusion. The integrated air defense system did not engage, because it does not lock onto friendly aircraft. This was an own goal of catastrophic proportions. If this were an isolated anomaly, one might attribute it to the fog of war. But the data indicates a systemic pathology. The Russian Air Force appears to have normalized the bombardment of its own territory as a standard combat procedure. Intercepted audio, released by the GER, featuring a civilian call from the affected zone, confirmed the horror. A resident of Belgorod stated that in 11 days, Russian pilots had dropped 8 bombs on their region, 8 munitions in 11 days, a near-daily rhythm of friendly fire. The macro picture is even more damning. Data from the independent Telegram channel Astra indicates that since the beginning of 2025, Russian aircraft have dropped at least 133 aerial bombs on Russian border regions and occupied territories. Other sources cite 128. Regardless of the exact integer, the strategic reality remains constant. This year, Russia has conducted more airstrikes on its own soil than on many adversary sectors. For military attachés in Brussels or London, this represents an inept doctrine, unprecedented in the annals of modern military aviation. In July 2024, a Russian bomber jettisoned a FAB 3000, a 3-ton munition considered one of the most destructive non-nuclear weapons in the arsenal, onto the Belgorod region. 3 tons of explosive yield did not vaporize a Ukrainian fortification. It rained down on a Russian village. Such a pattern of failure cannot be dismissed solely as technical error. Behind these incidents lies the degraded morale and proficiency of the pilot corps. Many aviators, paralyzed by the threat of Ukraine's layered air defense network, appear terrified to enter the engagement envelope. They hastily jettison ordnance from a standoff distance while still within Russian airspace, executing a rapid egress. When fear intersects with incompetence, the result is no longer collateral damage, but cowardly negligence. Rather than completing the mission profile and facing Patriot batteries over Ukraine, pilots elect to purge their payload on their own citizens and return to base. For Western observers, particularly taxpayers underwriting aid packages, this raises a pertinent question. Who is actually being protected by Russia's billions in defense spending when the military cannot safeguard its own rear areas? For European capitals, the existence of a nuclear-armed force with chaotic operational standards heightens the risk of accidental escalations spilling across borders. The disintegration of the VKS is not confined to the airspace. It manifests lethally on the ground. within the supposed safety of hardened shelters. The broader diagnostic reveals that it is not merely the hardware that is failing, but the human element. A horrific incident detailed by The Sun serves as a stark exemplar. At a Russian airbase, 2 pilots in a parked bomber initiated their ejection sequence. They neglected or ignored a fatal detail. Above them was not open sky, but a reinforced concrete hangar ceiling. The mechanism activated, rocket motors ignited, and 2 servicemen were launched at near supersonic velocity into the ceiling, resulting in immediate, gruesome fatalities. Russian military aviation blogs like Fighter Bomber categorize this as an accident. However, it indicates that personnel training, discipline, and psychological stability have hit a nadir. Initiating ejection within a hangar is not a minor error. It is a terminal decision born of ignorance or extreme psychological duress. As Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Inat noted, this was merely the latest link in a lengthening chain of Russian incompetence. At the other end of that chain are those who choose betrayal over death. The operational choices for Russian pilots are narrowing, take off in a mechanically suspect aircraft to bomb one's own city, die in a hangar accident, or choose the third option, the one the Kremlin fears most: defection. Recall the 6-month Operation Sinitsa, conducted by Ukrainian intelligence in 2023, culminating in the defection of a Russian Mi-8 pilot. He not only landed his rotary wing asset, but delivered it loaded with critical fighter jet spare parts to a Ukrainian base in Poltava. His compensation, $500,000, and the guarantee of safety for his family in the West. This narrative underscores a strategic reality. Russian pilots are no longer fighting for ideology. When an officer is willing to hand over a strategic asset to the enemy for financial security, what motivation remains for the rank and file? Those dropping bombs on Belgorod are the remnant force, demotivated, fearful, and technically deficient. The Kremlin has trained them poorly, placed them under unsustainable operational tempo, and forced them into unreliable airframes to the point where defection or indiscriminate bombing, followed by retreat, appears more rational than heroic death. The Russian Air Force is caught in a vice, a technological deficit with hung ordnance and faulty guidance kits, and a human capital crisis characterized by desertion and negligence. Thus, the blackout in Belgorod is not merely a grid failure, it may be recorded in history as the moment Russian military power buckled under its own gravitational weight. An army that drops 128 bombs on its own territory in a year forfeits the title of superpower. Pilots who eject into concrete ceilings cannot be classified as military professionals. They resemble victims of a war the Kremlin insists on prolonging. The conflict Putin launched has boomeranged across the border to strike the motherland. As the citizens of Belgorod sit in darkness, they witness a preview of their national future. Those pilots and those munitions will not vanish, but the error rate may multiply. The next deviation may not strike a substation, but a fissile material storage site or a high-density urban center. In this context, for many analysts, the primary existential threat to Russia is no longer NATO, but the decaying ordnance in its depots and the exhausted aviators in its cockpits. Empires are rarely destroyed by external blows alone. They crumble from internal fractures. The explosion in Belgorod may well be the acoustic signature of that fracture. While Russian pilots, driven by fear and chaos, are immolating their own infrastructure across the zero line, a diametrically opposed air campaign is unfolding. The Ukrainian Air Force is evolving in the opposite direction of Russia's systemic collapse, executing operations with astonishing precision. Numerically, their fleet is a fraction of Russia's hundreds of airframes. Most are legacy Soviet platforms, but the critical differentiator is doctrinal. They fly to achieve kinetic results. While Russia dropped 128 bombs on itself, Ukrainian aviators struck Putin's high-value targets with surgical precision, even from standoff ranges of hundreds of kilometers. This reflects a disparity not just in skill, but in mindset, technology, and adaptability. Ukraine's asymmetric advantage lies in fusing scarce resources with ingenuity and Western integration, While Russian pilots struggle with crude UMPK kits and strike their own civilians, Ukraine has integrated NATO standard precision-guided munitions onto legacy airframes. The employment of the JDAM, Joint Direct Attack Munition Extended Range, is the prime exemplar. Ukrainian pilots launch these assets from aging MiG 29 seconds, releasing them outside the engagement envelope of Russian air defenses, yet striking the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, key Crimean airfields, and logistical nodes with pinpoint accuracy. While Russian pilots miss their own substations, Ukrainian pilots can decapitate ammunition depots from 100 kilometers out. This contrast exposes Russia's military deficiencies even to Putin's domestic base. While amplifying psychological pressure on Russian aircrews, they must contend not only with ground-based S-300, S-400 threats, but also with long-range, precision air-to-ground strikes via JDAM-ER. The small but lethal Ukrainian air presence has shattered Putin's initial claim of total air superiority. The secret behind Ukrainian success lies in motivation, training, and doctrinal adaptability. While many Russian pilots opt for indiscriminate bombing runs followed by rapid egress to preserve life, Ukrainian pilots view every sortie as potentially their last stand for national survival. Western training did not merely impart stick and rudder skills, it instilled modern tactical doctrine suited for multi-domain warfare. The ingenuity of mating legacy Soviet airframes with modern NATO sensor and weapon packages is the clearest evidence of this evolutionary process. That success has paved the way for an even greater threat to Moscow, the F-16 squadrons. These are not merely faster airframes. The F-16 represents a quantum leap in combat capability, avionics, and weapons integration that widens the gap the VKS is facing. If Ukraine can inflict strategic damage with legacy MiGs, the projection of power once F-16 seconds achieve full operational capability will be exponential. Since the introduction of F-16 seconds into the Ukrainian order of battle, Putin's narrative of airspace control has become indefensible. Simultaneously, Ukraine's success exposes two painful truths to the Russian public. First, mercenaries, motivated by coin like the defecting Mi-8 pilot, are never as reliable as patriots fighting for sovereignty. Second, the Russian military, touted by the Kremlin as invincible, cannot even hit its own substations accurately, while the Ukrainian military can sever the Kremlin's most valuable logistical arteries with surgical strikes. All of this further undermines Putin's efforts to conceal the true cost of the war from the populace, just as he attempted to downplay the economic crisis. Now, Russians confront not only empty supermarket shelves, but also the smoking ruins of power stations in their own cities. And those ruins communicate a singular message: they are not safe in the hands of their current leadership. So, in your assessment, with an army that systematically bombards its own territory while facing an adversary that maximizes limited resources to strike strategic nodes, where does the trajectory of Russia and the European security order lead? Share your strategic perspective in the comments. Thank you for following this analysis to its conclusion.